The sky over Titanus IV had always been calm, filled with golden clouds and soft blue light. Children played under the twin suns, and farmers worked their fields without fear. It was one of the far colonies, a place where people had come to start. Fresh, they built homes, schools, hospitals, and even music halls. It was quiet, peaceful, and beautiful. But that peace ended in a single day. From the edge of space, black ships came without warning. They didn't send a message, didn't ask for surrender. They simply opened fire. Titanus IV had no real defense. The small patrol ships were old and outmatched within the first 10 minutes. All of them were destroyed. The people on the ground had no idea what was happening. Fire falling from the sky. Explosions tore through buildings, roads cracked, and screams filled the air. Mothers held their children and ran into underground shelters. Doctors pulled wounded from burning wreckage, and still, the black ships rained down fire. The enemy was the Zarkitha race, known for its brutal power and hunger for conquest. They had crushed dozens of alien worlds before and saw humans as nothing but weak creatures. To them, Titanus IV was not a place full of life, was just another target. When Earth received the distress signal, they were shocked. No one had expected the Zarketh to attack so far from the warfront. Titanus IV had no military value, it was a home. But that didn't matter to the enemy. Admiral Greaves of Terran Fleet Command watched the live feed from orbit. His hands were clenched into fists as he saw the flames cover the colony. "We're too late," he whispered. The reinforcement fleet was still 4 hours away. Titanus IV would not last that long. He gave the order to keep broadcasting rescue beacons, but deep down, he knew they wouldn't reach in time. On the ground, one man, Captain Elias Reyes, was trapped inside the city with his young daughter. He had taken leave from the military to visit her after years apart. Now, as buildings fell around them, he held her tightly. They ran from one shelter to another, but nothing was safe for her. Long dust and smoke filled the air, and the sound of plasma strikes shook the ground. People cried out for help, and Reyes tried to help who he could. But he was only one man, and his daughter was his priority. School building collapsed in front of them, blocking the road. Reyes heard screams from inside. Children were trapped. He looked at his daughter, kissed her forehead, and said, "Stay. Behind the wall, baby daddy will be right back," without waiting. He ran into the crumbling building. He found 6 children hiding under broken desks, crying, with fire behind him. Reyes picked them up one by one and carried them out when he came for the last 2. The ceiling gave way. The blast threw him outside, burning his arm. But the kids were safe. His daughter ran to him, tears in her eyes. "You're hurt." She said, "I'm okay," he lied, pulling her close. By nightfall, half the colony was gone. Hospitals were full, coms were broken, and many shelters had collapsed. Still, people kept helping each other, sharing food and carrying the wounded. That was what made humans different. Even in hopeless moments, they didn't break, they didn't surrender, they just kept going. When the Terran fleet finally arrived, they found a wasteland. The Zarketh had pulled back after destroying what they wanted. Maybe they didn't even see humans as worth finishing off. Or maybe they just wanted to send a message. We can take whatever we want. The rescue teams moved fast, looking for survivors. They found Captain Reyes unconscious, still holding his daughter. She was alive, shaking, but breathing. He had wrapped his jacket around her and taken the worst of the cold and dust. They brought them up to the medical bay of the TFS Deliverance. As Reyes opened his eyes, the Admiral stood by his side. "We're sorry we were late," he said quietly. Reyes didn't speak at first. He looked at his sleeping daughter and then said, "Don't let this happen again." Back on Earth, the news of Titanus IV caused public anger and sorrow. People gathered in streets, lighting candles for the dead. But sorrow turned into resolve. Humans had lost worlds before, but something about Titanus hit harder. It was too sudden, too cruel. The Terran Council held an emergency meeting, and for the first time, they voted to change the war policy. No more retreat, no more waiting. They would hold the line wherever that line had to be drawn. A single ship was chosen to be the first to stand. It wasn't the biggest or the newest, but it had something no other ship had. A crew that had lost everything and a captain with a fire in his soul. Captain Reyes volunteered to command it. He stood before the fleet command and said, "If we die, let it be loud enough for the stars to hear." That ship would be named the Valiant, and its mission was simple: hold the next line or die trying, because after Titanus 4, the galaxy would learn humans may fall, but they never stay down. The hangar was quiet, filled with shadows and flickering lights as Captain Elias Reyes walked slowly toward the ship that would carry him to war. It stood tall in the center, scarred and battle-worn, with patches on its hull and faded paint. This was the Valiant, the ship chosen to make the Zarkith think twice before attacking again. Most officers had expected a newer vessel for such an important mission. But Reyes had chosen the Valiant himself. He didn't want new and polish. He wanted real and proven. He didn't need perfection. He needed a ship that knew pain and still flew through it. The crew began arriving one by one. They came from different parts of the galaxy: pilots, engineers, gunners, medics. Some had lost family on Titanus. For others had survived earlier battles and never spoken of them. There was no cheering, no celebration. They didn't meet with laughter or loud greetings. Instead, they shook hands firmly, looked into each other's eyes, and nodded in silence. They all knew why they were here. Each of them had something to prove, something to avenge the ships. Mechanic, a young woman named Hannah, ran her hand across the control panel. "It's a miracle this thing still flies," she whispered. Reyes stood beside her and said, "Then we'll give them a miracle." She smiled faintly and got to work. Every bolt she tightened felt like preparing a shield for someone she loved. The ship's AI had a calm, older man's voice. It greeted them simply. "Welcome back, Captain Reyes," he replied. "Let's wake her up." Slowly, systems lit up. The engines hummed, and lights flickered to life across the decks. The Valiant had slept long enough. Now it was ready to roar again. Their mission briefing was short. No long speeches, no fake hope. They were to travel to Kellis Prime, a small planet near a new Zarketh front. Scouts reported a large enemy fleet heading there. Earth's High Command had made a hard choice: send one ship ahead to slow the invasion. The rest of the fleet would follow 2 days later. But those 2 days could mean the difference between survival or destruction for nearby colonies. The Valiant would have to hold the line completely alone. Most would have called it a suicide mission, but Reyes didn't think that way anymore. He believed in one thing now: the enemy wanted to break through. They had to pay in blood. The crew prepared in silence. Weapons were checked, shields reinforced, engines cleaned. They ate their meals together, but didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Each person knew their role, and each person carried their ghosts. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than words. On the night before departure, Reyes stood alone in the observation deck. He stared at the stars, his reflection faint in the glass. Behind him, Lieutenant Kane walked in, the ship's second-in-command. "You should sleep," Kane said softly. Reyes shook his head. "Every time I close my eyes, I see the fire." Kane didn't ask which fire. He already knew. Titanus burned behind both of their thoughts, always. "We'll give them a fight they'll never forget," Kane said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Reyes nodded slowly. No mercy. The next morning, the docking clamps released, and the Valiant rose into space. The stars stretched around them as they left the safety of orbit. Back on Earth, People watched the feed in silence. Some cried, some prayed, and some just stared. They weren't watching a ship. They weren't watching their hope fly away. A small boy at a refugee shelter looked at the screen and asked his mother, "Will they stop the monsters?" She held him close and whispered, "They'll try harder than anyone ever has." On board, Reyes walked through the halls, checking each department. He gave simple nods to the crew, and they returned them with quiet respect. No one joked. No one asked foolish questions. They were past fear now. They were sharpened by it. In the engine room, Hannah had taped a photo of her family to the wall. They had died on Mars outpost during a surprise raid. Reyes saw it, didn't say a word, and just nodded. Everyone had lost someone, and now they had a chance to make it matter. As they neared Kellis Prime, the tension grew. Scanners showed nothing yet, but they all knew what was coming. A Zarkath fleet was on its way, leased 40 ships, heavy war-class vessels. The Valiant was one. One old, tired ship against an armada, but the Valiant was more than just metal and systems. It was filled with people who had lost everything and still chose to fight. It was filled with rage, love, courage, and fire. It wasn't just a ship anymore. It was a message. The crew gathered in the main briefing room, and Reyes stood before them. "I won't lie to you," he said. "They're coming. And we are badly outnumbered." No one flinched. "We don't fight to win today, not in the way most think. We fight to make sure they bleed. We fight to show them that humans never fall quietly. If we die, then we die loud, and if we live, they'll remember why they feared us." He paused, looking around at the eyes that stared back. "So load the guns, charge the shields," he said, "and let's welcome them to hell." The room stayed quiet for a moment, then someone started clapping. Soon they all joined a nod in joy. But in unity, they were ready. As the Valiant entered the orbit of Kellis Prime, Reyes looked at the stars and whispered, "Come and get us." Because now the war had a new face. It was no longer just fleets and numbers. It was one ship, one crew, and one final line in the sand. And that line would hold, no matter the cost. The Valiant hovered silently in orbit above Kellis Prime. The planet below was quiet, empty, its surface cold and covered in dust. It had no cities, no people, nothing of value, but it sat at a crossroads between several human colonies. The Zarkeith wanted it, not for its land, but for its position. If they took Kellis Prime, they would have a direct path to 3 unprotected human settlements. That's why the Valiant was here to block that path. To hold the line, the crew worked quickly, checking every system again and again. Weapons were fully charged, shields tested, emergency protocols prepared. Everyone moved with focus and purpose. There was no panic, just quiet tension, like the air before a storm. Reyes stood on the bridge, watching the radar. The screen was still empty, but he knew that wouldn't last. He looked at Kane, who sat beside him at the command console. "They're late," Kane said. Forcing a small smile, "They're coming," Reyes replied without emotion. And then the screen lit up. Dozens of red dots appeared on the edge of the radar, large and closing in. "All hands to battle stations," Reyes ordered. His voice steady, the alarm sounded across the ship. Red lights flashing through the halls. Crew members took their positions, strapping in and preparing for what could be their last fight. No one spoke. No one hesitated. They had trained for this moment, lived for it, and now it was here. The Zarkeith fleet approached in perfect formation, 40 ships, sleek and black, glowing with blue energy. They were beautiful in a deadly way, like knives dancing through space. Their lead ship opened a communication channel. A deep, cruel voice echoed through the Valiant speakers. "One ship. Is this a joke?" No one on the bridge replied. The voice continued. "Retreat, humans, or die like those before you." Still, no answer. Reyes leaned forward and said one word. Fire. The Valiant's forward cannons lit up with a powerful burst. The enemy ship didn't expect it. Its shields were still lowering from travel mode. The blast struck it directly in the center, and just like that, one of the largest Zarketh warships exploded into fire. For a second, there was silence. Then the enemy fleet began to move, angry, shocked, ready to crush the single ship that had dared to strike first. The battle had begun. Lasers and plasma bolts flew in every direction. The Valiant spun, dodged, and fired again, striking a second ship's engines. The explosion lit up the dark side of Kellis Prime. Inside the Valiant, the ship shook with each near hit. Sparks flew from broken panels. Alarms screamed. And damaged crews raced through the halls. But the crew never wavered. Hannah stayed in engineering, rerouting power and fixing systems faster than anyone thought possible. I need more thrust, shouted the pilot. Take it from life support. Hannah yelled back, you can breathe later. In the weapons room, Gunner Jace manually controlled the rail cannons. His hands bled from recoil vibrations, but he didn't stop. He growled. Let's see how many of you cowards I can take down. Another enemy ship exploded under his fire, and then another, but the Valiant was being hit too. A heavy blast struck the starboard side, tearing through armor. 3 crew members were lost in an instant. A fire broke out near the medbay, and still, Reyes gave the same order. Keep firing. The enemy surrounded them now, moving like a pack of wolves. But the Valiant fought like a cornered lion. Every weapon was fired. Every trick used. They launched decoys, jammed signals, even faked an explosion to hide there. Location for 10 seconds. 10 seconds was enough to reposition and strike back. The enemy was confused. This one ship should have been destroyed in minutes. Instead, it had taken out 7 of theirs and damaged 10 more. They started to realize something dangerous. This wasn't just a ship. It was a message. On the bridge, Reyes bled from a cut on his forehead. The air was filled with smoke and the smell of burning wires. But his eyes stayed sharp. They're hesitating. Kane said, watching the radar. Good, Reyes replied. Let them. The crew was tired, injured, and running low on ammunition, but none of them stopped. Each one remembered why they were here. They weren't fighting for victory. They were fighting to show the galaxy that humanity would never go quietly. The Zarketh tried to send another message. Human ship, stand down, we will spare your lives. Reyes pressed a button and replied coldly, this ship doesn't surrender. Then he turned off the comms and ordered, charge the last missile. It was a massive fusion warhead. The last of its kind. The Valiant had saved it for one. Purpose to strike fear. They locked onto the Zarketh command ship and launched it. The missile flew fast, glowing white with deadly energy. The enemy tried to shoot it down, but it was too fast. It struck dead center. The blast was so large it lit up the orbit like a second sun. The Zarketh command ship broke apart into burning pieces. The fleet paused, stunned again. They had never known fear, not until now. Not until a single human ship showed them what real defiance looked like. The Valiant floated through the fire. Its hull damaged, but still standing. On Earth, the live feed was delayed. But when it arrived, Galaxy watched in awe. A single human ship against an entire fleet. And it was still there, still fighting, still holding the line. The name of the Valiant would be whispered in every corner of the stars. Not as a myth, but as a truth. And the Zarketh would learn that while they may conquer worlds with ease, a single human ship full of grief, rage, and love could hold back an empire. Even if only for one day, that day would never be forgotten. The battle above Kellis Prime turned the sky into a storm of fire and broken metal. The Valiant flew through the chaos like a ghost. its engines glowing red-hot and its hull full of holes. But it didn't stop moving, didn't stop fighting. It was a dance of death now, fast and brutal, where every second counted. The enemy ships were everywhere, closing in, trying to trap the Valiant from all sides. But Reyes and his crew refused to be cornered. They used gravity slings around the planet's orbit, diving close to the surface to lose pursuers. They vanished into the dark side of the planet, only to appear again with a surprise attack. It was like watching a wounded animal fight with the strength of 10. Inside the ship, the lights flickered, and the air smelled of smoke and burning. Wires, panels sparked, metal groaned, and voices shouted over the sound of alarms. But every crew member was at their post, focused, bloody, and determined. Even with shields failing and weapons overheating, they held on. Each action felt like a final move, yet no one gave up. Gunner Jace had run out of automated rounds. So he switched to manual loading. His hands burned from touching overheated shells. His eyes were red, but he kept muttering, "Just a few more. Just a few more." In the engine room, Hannah worked with 2 other engineers, rerouting power and fixing coolant leaks. She had wrapped her arm in wires to stop a bleeding wound, but didn't slow down. "If the engines die, we die," she kept saying, "and I'm not ready to die on the bridge." Reyes stared at the holomap, watching the enemy ships move like hunters. They were changing tactics, learning from earlier losses. "They're adapting," Kane said, wiping blood from his forehead. "They're not arrogant anymore." Reyes answered, "Good," he added. "Fear makes them slow." One of the smaller Zarkith's ships broke formation and rushed toward them. Reyes ordered all forward guns to fire. The shot hit perfectly, slicing the enemy in half. But the explosion sent a wave of energy that hit the Valiant hard. The lights went out for 5 seconds, and in those 5 seconds, everyone on board thought it was over. But then the systems restarted. Backup power kicked in, and the engines roared to life. They were alive, barely, and so was their mission. The crew didn't cheer. They just kept going. They were running on pain, loss, and pure will. They didn't care if they won or lost. They just wanted to show the Zarkith that humanity would not be broken. Reyes looked at the damage report. 1/3 of the ship's systems were down. They had lost half their torpedoes, and the shield generator was hanging by a thread. But they had one last move. He activated a hidden system called Blackout Protocol. It had only been tested once, and it nearly fried the ship's core. It would turn the Valiant invisible for 30 seconds. Using experimental energy displacement, a suicide button. Really? But Reyes knew those 30 seconds might be the only chance they had to strike back one more time. He gave the order, blackout. In 5 seconds, he said, brace for system shock. The ship went dark, again no lights, no noise, just silence. The Zarkith scanners lost them completely. They scattered, confused, looking for a ship that had just vanished. Meanwhile, the Valiant moved behind them like a shadow, slow and silent. They reappeared right behind the biggest remaining enemy vessel. The crew aimed every weapon they had and fired. The explosion was massive. A bright white light that split space open like a wound. The enemy ship cracked in half, its engines imploding. One moment it was their giant, powerful, deadly. The next, it was gone. The Zarkith fleet stopped moving. For the first time in their history, they hesitated. They weren't just shocked, they were afraid. Afraid of a single human ship that should have been dead an hour ago. And yet, it still fought, still killed, still stood in their path, inside the Valiant. The price of the attack was clear. The engines were overheating. Systems offline, oxygen dropping fast, medical bay was full, and the crew was running out of time. But no one complained. No one begged to turn back. They just waited for the next order. Reyes stared at the damage readouts. He knew they couldn't last much longer. The enemy still had 15 ships left. and the Valiant was burning from the inside out. But he also knew they had already won something far more important than survival. They had changed the story. The Zarkath now knew what humans were made of. He stood in front of the crew's main screen and activated internal comms. "This ship is dying," he said. Voice calm, "but every second we stay in this sky, we make history. We are not just soldiers, we are a message." He looked at each face on the screen. "Let's make that message louder." The crew replied with a simple word: "Together as one. Ready?" And with that, the Valiant turned toward the remaining Zarkath fleet. Broken, bleeding, and barely holding together, but still flying, still dangerous, still human. The enemy didn't know it yet, but this was the moment that would change everything. Because the galaxy had never seen anything like it. A single ship dancing through death, refusing to fall. Each move said the same thing: "We are not done yet." And as the Valiant charged once more into the fire, the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath, watching a ship that should have died long ago, but instead chose to burn its name into history forever, with courage, with fire, and with fury. This was not just war. This was the story of humanity's will, and it was only beginning. The sky above Kellis Prime was full of smoke, fire, and the floating remains of destroyed ships. The Valiant, half broken and burning, still moved through the battlefield like a ghost that refused to die. Its engines coughed with every burst. Lights flickered weakly, and many systems were completely offline. But the heart of the ship, the crew, was still fighting, still breathing, still hoping. Captain Reyes stood on the bridge, covered in blood and sweat, his hand gripping the console to stay upright. He could barely stand, but his voice was clear. "How many of them are left?" he asked. Lieutenant Kane replied, 14 enemy ships. "And we're down to 3 weapons." Reyes nodded slowly, his eyes not showing fear. He had known from the start this mission might end with their deaths, but now he saw something different in the enemy's movements. They weren't rushing in anymore, they were staying back, circling, afraid to come too close. The Valiant had killed too many of them. They were confused. How could one human ship cause so much damage? In the engine room, Hannah was barely awake, her hands black with oil and blood. She had been awake for over 30 hours, using every trick she knew to keep the engines running. Pieces of the ship had fallen on her, but she didn't stop. Every time the ship moved, every time it dodged a hit, it was because of her, she whispered to herself. Just hold together a little longer. Just a little more. In the medbay, wounded crew members lay on stretchers, many too injured to return to duty, but even they refused to rest completely. One of them, a young medic named Tessa, stood over a table, fixing a broken injector. She had a cracked rib and a bleeding leg, but when asked why she was still working, she simply said, "Someone needs to be ready when the next one falls." The ship's AI, damaged from enemy blasts, spoke in a glitchy voice, "Captain, reactor. Unstable, danger." Critical Reyes looked at the flashing core status and knew time was running out. If the reactor failed, they'd all be gone in seconds. They had to decide. Try to escape or use what was left for one final strike. Reyes walked to the center of the bridge, standing tall despite the pain in his body. He looked at his crew and said, "We always knew we might not make it home." No one spoke, but everyone watched him. "We can still escape," he continued. "There's a small chance we might survive if we run now." He paused, then said quietly, "But if we stay and hit them one last time, we'll make sure they never forget us." For a moment, the bridge was silent. Then Kane stood up and said, "I didn't come here to run." One by one, the others agreed. Gunner Jace, face pale and bruised, raised a fist and growled, "Let's make them remember." Reyes gave the order to activate Last Stand Protocol. It was a hidden system buried deep inside the Valiant's core. A powerful fusion overload designed to turn the ship into a massive explosion. It would burn brighter than a star, destroying anything within range. But it would also kill everyone on board. There was no turning back once activated. The crew had 5 minutes to prepare. Some sat quietly, writing messages to family on old data chips. Others cleaned their weapons, even though they knew they wouldn't. Fired them again. A few simply sat and looked out the windows at the stars, thinking about the people they loved, the homes they'd left behind, and the reason they were here. Reyes walked through the ship one last time. He checked on the wounded, thanked the engineers, and shared a long, quiet look with Hannah. No words were needed, just a nod of respect. He returned to the bridge, stood in the center, and spoke too. "The AI begin the countdown," he said. The ship's voice replied, "Last stand protocol activated. Detonation in 300 seconds." As the countdown began, the Valiant turned toward the enemy fleet. The Zarketh scanned the ship and saw the power building in its core. They realized too late what the humans were about to do. Some of their ships began to back away. Others tried to rush forward and destroy the Valiant before it could explode. But it was too late. Reyes gave the final command: lock on target and hold. The ship flew straight into the center of the enemy formation. The Zarketh opened fire. But the shots bounced off what little shielding remained. They were panicking now. A single human ship was about to take down the heart of their fleet. Inside the Valiant, the crew stood quietly at their posts. No fear, no anger, just pride. They knew what they had done. They had held the line, and now they would finish the fight. The countdown reached 0. The ship's core went white. Then everything turned to light. A wave of pure energy blasted. Out in all directions, the Zarketh ships closest to the explosion were torn apart instantly. Others were thrown off course, damaged, crippled. The sky went silent, the fire faded, and the Valiant was gone. But its name remained. Across the galaxy, people heard what had happened. One ship had held back an entire fleet. It had died, yes, but not before showing the enemy that humans were not weak, not broken, not afraid. The Valiant didn't fall. It chose to burn, and the stars would never forget it. The explosion over Kellis Prime could be seen across 3 systems. It was like a second sun had been born in space, only to disappear within seconds. Everything went silent. After that, no more gunfire, no more signals, no more movement. The Valiant was gone, turned into light, fire, and legend. And so were the brave souls who had chosen to stay on board, back on Earth. People gathered around large screens in every city, watching the final moments. The feed had cut just before the explosion. Only static remained. But even that silence said more than words ever could in the refugee shelters, in space stations, and in the quiet corners of colonies. People stood frozen. No one cheered, no one clapped. They just stood in silence, with tears in their eyes and their hearts full of something powerful: pride. The Terran Fleet Command received the full report an hour later. The Valiant had destroyed 9 enemy ships directly. The rest of the Zarketh fleet had pulled back, some damaged, some retreating. It was the first time the Zarketh had ever turned away from a battle. They hadn't just lost ships, they had lost confidence. Admiral Greaves read the report with shaking hands. He looked at the final transmission from Captain Reyes. It was only one line: make it count. Across the stars, the Valiant's name began to spread. Not as a number, not as a loss, but as a symbol. Schools taught children about the ship. That held the line. Songs were written about it. Pilots painted its name on their armor. People who had never held a weapon before began volunteering for defense forces. Even old veterans came out of retirement. The Valiant had reminded them all what it meant to be human, but what no one knew was that the story wasn't over. Deep in a frozen part of space, far from the blast zone. A small escape pod floated silently, dark and hidden. Inside it, 3 figures lay unconscious. Barely alive, Captain Reyes, Engineer Hannah, and Medic Tessa. They had launched the pod seconds before the explosion. It was a secret order of backup plan known only to Reyes and the AI. The AI had calculated that someone needed to survive. Someone had to carry the truth. The pod had almost no power, no engine, and no way to send signals. It drifted for days. Cold and quiet, Reyes opened his eyes first, gasping as he took in the freezing air. He looked around and saw the others, breathing but weak. The small heater in the pod barely worked. Food was limited to a few energy packs, and water came from melted ice. Still, they were alive, and that was enough. Reyes recorded a message on an old storage chip. He spoke slowly, his voice raspy. "If anyone finds this, know that the Valiant didn't die in vain." He paused, and we're not finished yet. Days turned into weeks. The pod drifted closer to a minor shipping lane used by cargo haulers. They had no idea if they'd be seen, but they never gave up. Hannah stayed awake to keep the power from dropping too low. Tessa made sure their wounds didn't get worse, using whatever was in the medkit. Reyes kept watch, speaking quietly to the AI system. Now limited to a blinking red light, it was their only company in the dark. Finally, after 17 days in space, a signal was picked up by a civilian mining vessel. The crew of the mining ship thought it was debris, but when they pulled it in and opened the hatch, they saw 3 frozen, half-dead humans. They sent a message to Earth right away. "We found survivors." Repeat, survivors from the Valiant. The news spread faster than light. The impossible had happened. 3 crew members had lived. Earth held its breath again as they were brought back. People gathered in crowds, holding signs, crying, shouting. It wasn't just about survival. It was about proof. Proof that the ones who had faced the enemy with no fear were still among them. Reyes woke up in a hospital bed, lights soft above him. A nurse leaned over and whispered, "You're safe, sir." His eyes opened slowly, and the first thing he asked was, "Did it work?" The nurse smiled. Yes. It worked. The president of Earth came to visit him. So did the families of the fallen crew. Reyes was offered medals, titles, money, even political power. He refused them all. He only asked for one thing: "Give me another ship." The people didn't see him as just a hero. They saw him as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, a small group of humans could change everything. Even when the enemy had numbers, power, and technology. Humans had something else. Heart. The Terran Council approved the construction of a new fleet. Smaller, faster, more powerful. The name of the lead ship, the Valiant II, and its first captain, Elias Reyes. The survivors of the first Valiant became leaders, trainers, and symbols. They didn't talk much about the past, but when they did, they always ended with the same words. We held the line, and the galaxy listened, because they knew if another war ever came, humanity wouldn't need 1,000 ships. It's just one like the Valiant, and the enemy would remember that once they tried to break through, but a single ship stood in their way and never moved, not even when it burned. The news that 3 crew members of the Valiant had survived spread across every human colony. People could hardly believe it. They had seen the explosion. They had mourned the crew. They had lit candles and said goodbye. But now, those candles were burning again, not for loss, but for hope. Captain Elias Reyes, Engineer Hannah, and Medic Tessa had lived. Some called it a miracle. Others called it fate. But one thing was clear. The legend of the Valiant was far from over. Captain Reyes had become a symbol of courage. But he never acted like a hero. He stayed quiet, focused, and serious. He visited the families of the crew who had died, speaking with them one by one. He didn't give speeches. He just listened. Sometimes that was enough. Hannah was still recovering, but her mind never stopped working. She spent her days inside the military labs, designing new engine systems. She knew exactly what had gone wrong in the Valiant's final moments, and she was determined to fix it for the next ship. No more burning cores, she whispered to herself as she sketched designs. No more last chances. Tessa, the medic, chose a different path. She began training medics across the fleet, teaching them not just how to save lives, but how to stay calm under fire. You're not just here to patch wounds, she told them. You're here to hold the soul of the ship together when everything is falling apart. Together. The three of them became something more than survivors. They became leaders of a new generation. Earth had changed since the battle. There was no more fear in the air, just resolve. The Terran Council ordered the building of new ships, not hundreds, but dozens, each one crafted with better weapons, better shields, and faster engines. But most important of all, each ship carried the same symbol on its hull, a simple white star with the name Valiant beneath it. The Zarketh, once seen as unstoppable, had gone quiet. They had pulled their forces back to the inner edges of their territory. They didn't send any more threats, didn't take any more colonies. They watched from a distance now, trying to understand how one single ship had changed everything. What the Zarketh didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was the human heart. They had studied human technology, human strategy, even human politics, but they never saw what really mattered. The reason the Valiant had fought so hard wasn't because of orders. It was because of something deeper, something the Zarketh could never copy: human loyalty, love, and the willingness to die for one another. The new ship, Valiant 2, was almost ready. It stood tall inside the orbital dock above Earth, sleek, black with silver edges and full of power. It was faster, stronger, and smarter than the old one, but its soul would come from the crew. Reyes stood before the new crew for the first time. They were younger, some fresh from training, others with scars from earlier battles. He looked at each of them quietly before speaking. This ship has a name, he said. But it's not just a name, it's a promise that we do not run, a promise that we do not leave anyone behind, a promise that when the enemy comes, we do not break. They listened, not cheering, but nodding. They understood. They had all grown up hearing the story of the first Valiant. Now they were part of the next chapter. Hannah stood in the engine room of the Valiant 2 and smiled. Everything was running smooth, clean, cold, perfect. This is what she deserved, she whispered. She placed a small charm above the reactor. It was a broken piece of metal from the original ship, a reminder of where it all began. Tessa walked the new med bay and checked every tool, every cabinet, every emergency kit. She touched the wall gently and said, "Let's keep this one empty for a while." Then she added, "But I'll be ready if it's not." As the ship powered up for its first mission, something strange happened across the galaxy. A small group of Zarketh vessels appeared near a neutral planet. They didn't fire, didn't threaten. They sent a message. A single sentence: "We request a meeting." The Terran Council was shocked. The Zarketh had never spoken in peace, never asked for anything, they only took. Now, they wanted to talk. The Council asked Captain Reyes to represent Earth. At first, he refused. "I'm not a diplomat," he said, but they insisted. "You're more than a soldier, you're what they fear." And so, aboard the Valiant 2, Reyes traveled to the edge of Zarketh space. The enemy flagship met them. In silence, inside, the Zarketh leaders sat tall and cold, their faces unreadable. One of them stepped forward and said, "We do not understand. You were broken, weak, and yet you stood alone. Why?" Reyes looked at them and answered without blinking, "Because we're human. And humans don't stop until the job is done." There was a long silence. Then the Zarketh spoke again. We will not forget the valiant Reyes turned to leave and said just one thing. Good, because neither will we. When the Valiant 2 returned to Earth, it was greeted with silence again, not because the people didn't care, but because they now knew something deeper. Sometimes, silence says everything. Because heroes don't always wear medals. Sometimes they wear scars, sometimes they ride broken ships, and sometimes they hold the line so the rest of us never have to. The Valiant had become more than a ship. It had become the soul of a planet, and its legacy was just beginning. The return of Valiant marked a new beginning for humanity, not just as soldiers, but as leaders in a galaxy that had finally started to listen. What began with a war had now turned into something more. A conversation, a change, and a quiet respect, but peace, as always, was fragile. Captain Elias Reyes didn't trust the silence that followed the Zarkith meeting. It felt too easy to calm. He knew their nature cold, calculating, and proud. He didn't believe the enemy would give up just because of one ship. Even if that ship had destroyed half their fleet for weeks, the Valiant 2 patrolled neutral zones. Watching, waiting, searching for any sign of hidden activity, they met with small colonies. Helped rescue stranded ships. The crew grew stronger, more confident, but Reyes never relaxed. He knew something was coming, and he was right. One day, while traveling near the edge of a forgotten sector, the Valiant 2 picked up a strange signal weak. Broken, but clearly artificial, Hannah analyzed it and frowned. This signal. It's human, she said. Reyes leaned over her console. There's no human base out here. Tessa joined them, her eyes narrowing. Then someone doesn't want us to know they're out here. They followed the signal carefully, hiding. Their own presence, what they found, was shocking. A massive wreckage field floated silently in the darkness. Dozens of destroyed ships, human and alien. It was a hidden battlefield no one had ever reported. At the center of it, they found a half-functional satellite broadcasting a repeating message. They're building something. We couldn't stop them. Warn Earth. Suddenly, sensors lit up. 3 unknown ships appeared behind the wreckage Zarkith ships. But not like the others. They were smaller, faster, and covered in dark plating that absorbed scanner signals. Stealth fleet, Reyes whispered. So the Zarkith hadn't stopped. They had simply changed tactics. They were preparing in secret, testing new weapons. Maybe even building a second invasion force. Reyes ordered the Valiant 2 to pull back. But the enemy ships followed them silent and fast. What followed was a deadly chase through asteroid fields and gravity wells. The Valiant dodged rocks and plasma bolts, flying like a knife through the shadows. Hannah pushed the engines beyond safety levels. Tessa patched injured crew while holding onto walls during wild turns, and Reyes stood at the front, guiding them. Like a man who had seen death and learned how to outfly it, they barely escaped, jumping to hyperspace at the last second. But the truth was clear. This wasn't peace. It was a pause before a bigger storm back on Earth. The Council was shocked by the report. Many wanted to wait, to gather more evidence. But Reyes stood before them and said firmly, if we wait, they'll finish whatever they're building, and next time, one ship won't be enough. The Council asked, then what do you suggest? Reyes looked them in the eyes and replied, we show them we're ready, and so. For the first time in history, a joint fleet was formed, multiple human ships under one command. They called it the Line. Its purpose was simple. Protect the border. Strike first if needed, and never allow another tightness for Reyes. Was chosen to lead it, not because he asked for the role, but because no one else had earned the galaxy's respect the way he had. His name alone made enemies nervous. His silence in battle made his allies feel safe. Valiant 2 became the center of the line. Other ships joined from across Earth's systems, the Iron Wing, the Horizon, the Umberlight, and more. Each carried survivors, veterans, and new recruits who had grown up hearing about the Valiant. They didn't fight for medals, they fought to honor those who had come before them. Meanwhile, Hannah trained engineers in fast repair drills and emergency power control. Tessa created the first ever combat med teams, medics trained for frontline duty, and Reyes turned his bridge crew into something more than officers. He made them leaders. People who could command ships of their own when the time came. Then, after 3 months of silence, it happened. A Zarketh colony world suddenly went dark. Not destroyed, just missing. No signals, no movement, no trace. The line was sent to investigate. When they arrived, they found something terrifying. The planet had been evacuated. Not by humans, but by the Zarketh themselves. They had left behind massive machines. Drilling into the planet's core, Tessa gasped as she read the scans. "They're turning the planet into a weapon," Hannah whispered. "They're planning to drop it." Reyes said nothing at first. Then he gave the order. "Evacuate the area, then prepare to destroy the machines." The battle that followed was massive. The line fought together, moving like one body. They disabled the drills, destroyed the towers, and prevented the planet's collapse, but not without cost. 3 ships were damaged, and dozens of lives were lost. As the smoke cleared, Reyes stood on the Valiant II's bridge. He looked at the planet below and said, "They were testing us. They wanted to see if we were ready, and now they knew." The Zarketh had retreated once more, but this time not out of fear, out of caution. They had learned that humans didn't wait for death. They charged into it and brought others with them. Reyes sent a message across all systems. "We held the line once," he said. "Now we are the line." That message was played on every screen across Earth and beyond. It became the motto of the new generation, and every ship that left orbit carried it printed on its side. We are the line. Because the war might not be over, but neither were the humans. And this time, they weren't alone. They were ready, together, and they would never be broken again.